driver's license, and vehicle registration. Keep your hands where I can see them. Right now. The voice, cutting through the quiet afternoon, was a familiar command, yet carried an unsettling chill. On a deserted stretch of highway in Montgomery County, a black SUV with agency insignia slowly pulled over to the side of the road. The flashing red and green lights behind it reflected in the rearview mirror as harsh streaks of light, striking directly at the eyes of the occupant. Inside, a black man in his late 40s sat upright, his hands neatly placed on the steering wheel, palms open, motionless, each movement so precise that any well-trained officer would recognize it as a posture of absolute cooperation. He spoke in a calm, clear voice, neither high nor low, without a hint of provocation. "I am in uniform, officer. Tell me the reason for this stop." There was no reply. The officer standing outside the driver's door stared at him, his gaze not professional scrutiny, but rather as if he had already made up his mind. "Don't try to act smart with me," he snapped. "This isn't your territory. Are you still in this SUV?" A heavy silence ensued. The man in the car didn't move, only took a deep breath before replying, his voice strangely even. "No, officer. This is a county vehicle. I'm Deputy Sheriff William Carter. My badge is on my belt." He didn't bend down, didn't reach, only tilted slightly, so the gold badge on his belt buckle was more visible in the afternoon sun. But the reaction he received wasn't a change of attitude or a brief apology as should have been. Instead, the officer suddenly tightened his jaw, his hand sliding closer to the holster. "Don't move," he said, his voice harsh and sharp. "I haven't given you permission to touch anything." On the other side of the car, the second officer moved around to the back, his steps quick and decisive, as if approaching a dangerous suspect. He glanced through the window, into the back seat, into the trunk, then spoke loudly, deliberately, so the person inside could hear. "There's a lot of equipment in the back. Big bag, gear, radio. Something's not right." William Carter exhaled softly, slowly and deeply, the kind of breath a man accustomed to facing tension without letting it control his actions. "That's unit-issued equipment," he said, his voice low and controlled. "It's all Montgomery County. You can run the license plate or call the dispatcher to verify. It won't take a minute." That reasonable offer hung in the air, but went unanswered. The officer standing by the driver's door subtly curled his lips into a thin, cold smile. "We'll see for ourselves." It was at that moment that William sensed the change. It was no longer an unprofessional stop. The atmosphere suddenly became thick, carrying a sense of danger all too familiar to those who had worked in law enforcement for too long. It was the feeling of reason being pushed aside to make way for prejudice and ego. He kept both hands on the steering wheel, his back straight, his eyes fixed straight ahead, because he understood one thing more important than anything else at this moment. Everything that was happening was being recorded. Before this story goes any further, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel, because what happens next on this seemingly unknown stretch of highway will not only stun you, but will also expose a truth that many cannot ignore. William Carter remained seated in the car, his hands glued to the steering wheel, not out of fear, but because he understood that even the slightest movement could be interpreted dangerously. The flashing red and green lights behind him continued to swirl in the rearview mirror, their rhythmic blinking like an invisible countdown clock. Outside, the two officers continued moving, the sound of their shoes echoing in the otherwise quiet afternoon highway. William kept his gaze fixed, but in his mind, familiar pieces of his professional experience began to piece together. He had been in this profession for nearly 16 years, long enough to distinguish between a routine stop and a situation spiraling out of control, long enough to recognize when an officer was following procedure and when they were reacting based on emotion, hasty judgment, and unverified assumptions. This feeling was not unfamiliar to William. He'd seen it in the eyes of his colleagues as they walked into a crime scene with heads already full of prejudice. And he knew, once that wool started rolling, it was hard to stop without something strong enough to intervene. That afternoon should have been unremarkable. William wasn't chasing a suspect, wasn't involved in a major operation, and wasn't in an emergency. He'd just left the West Station after finishing a bunch of administrative paperwork and was driving back to the County Administration Building for a 2 o'clock meeting with the training department. His mind was preoccupied with whether he'd have time to stop by his usual sandwich shop near the courthouse. A very ordinary, commonplace thought, completely unrelated to guns, crime, or confrontation. The Chevrolet Tahoe he was driving was a Montgomery County-issued vehicle, the kind anyone who'd ever worked in law enforcement would recognize from afar. Government license plates, clearly displayed insignia on both front doors, emergency lights mounted on the roof, a specialized radio and computer system in the center console. Behind the vehicle were the standard equipment of a deputy on duty: tactical bag, body armor, medical supplies, a powerful flashlight, all neatly arranged and in accordance with regulations. Nothing suspicious, nothing to guess. William drove with the familiar demeanor of someone well-versed in the area's streets. One hand on the steering wheel, the other resting lightly on the armrest, the department's radio softly playing routine unit communications. No emergency calls, no alarm signals. Until, in the rearview mirror, he saw a white Crown Victoria emerge from the median, accelerating and closing in unusually close. The distance was so close that William could clearly see the two faces inside, their eyes fixed on the SUV he was driving. By professional instinct, William glanced at the license plate and recognized it as belonging to the Riverside City Police Department. Not his unit, but that wasn't surprising. The area had many overlapping jurisdictions. What caught his attention wasn't their presence, but the way they observed. The driver leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, as if trying to find some detail to corroborate an already formed thought. The passenger pointed at the computer screen on the dashboard, saying something to his partner with unnecessary urgency. William had seen that look too many times in his career. It was the look of officers who had jumped to conclusions before asking questions, of people reacting to what they thought they saw, not to reality. He sensed at the moment the Crown Victoria's lights flashed behind him and the signal to stop sounded. There was no surprise in William's heart, only a very subtle, very deep weariness. He knew that, given their approach, it was highly likely they hadn't checked the license plates, nor taken the time to verify the obvious markings on the car and on him personally. He slowly slowed down, pulled over, shifted to P, and activated his hazard lights. Every action was slow and precise, as if pre-programmed after years of training. His hands rested on the steering wheel, this time slightly higher, so that anyone approaching couldn't claim they didn't see. William looked in the rearview mirror and saw both officers get out of the car, the Crown Victoria doors slamming shut behind them. The way they approached him, shoulders tensed, hands near their holsters, wasn't a normal approach. It was the way people approach a situation where they've already mentally assessed danger. In that moment, William understood one thing: this story wouldn't end quickly. And no matter what he says or does, the truth is there's only one way to protect himself: stay calm, follow every detail of the process, and let all the cameras do the rest. Two officers approached the SUV, and from their final steps, William Carter could sense the tension radiating from them. Not the usual professional vigilance, but an excessive rigidity, as if they were preparing to confront a pre-planned threat. The officer standing by the driver's door stopped less than an arm's length from the windshield, leaning in to peer inside with a cold, scrutinizing gaze. Without introducing himself, stating his unit, or explaining the reason for the stop, he spoke in a sharp, commanding voice. More of an order than a conversation. "Keep your hands still. Don't do anything stupid." William didn't move. His hands remained on the steering wheel, palms facing up, so clearly visible that no one could deny it. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice calm and neutral. "I'm cooperating. Can you tell me the reason for this stop?" The question hung in the air, but once again, it received no answer. Instead, the officer leaned closer, his gaze sweeping over William's uniform as if it didn't exist, then settling on his face with a look of almost defiant suspicion. "Is this your car?" he asked, his voice heavy and accusatory. The question sounded so absurd that, if not in this situation, William might have thought it a clumsy joke. But there was nothing in the other man's eyes that suggested humor. William replied concisely, each word clear. "A Montgomery County vehicle. I am Deputy Sheriff William Carter, on duty." He tilted his body slightly, enough for the officers belt badge and name tag to be fully visible. On the other side, the second officer had circled around to the side door. He peered through the tinted glass, observing the car's interior with excessive intensity, as if searching for some detail to corroborate his suspicions. Then he let out a dry, sharp chuckle. "Oh, right, deputy. Uniforms are easy to buy online these days." The remark was not only sarcastic, but also contained a blatant denial of what was right before their eyes. William took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. "My papers and badge are on my belt. I'll slowly retrieve them for you to verify." That was his usual method in any identification situation, a clear announcement to avoid misunderstanding. But before he could move, the officer standing by the driver's door raised his hand, his palm open like an invisible wall. "No, don't touch anything. I haven't given permission." William stopped immediately. He knew that absolute compliance was the only protection against a situation that was deteriorating by the second. The officer at the passenger door continued to observe, then pointed toward the back of the car. "You're carrying quite a lot of gear," he said, his voice skeptical. "Large bag, equipment, radio, body armor. Doesn't look like a normal trip." William replied, still in his usual calm voice, "That's standard unit equipment. You can verify it by scanning the license plate or calling the dispatch center." The officer at the driver's door didn't answer immediately. He straightened up, his eyes cold, then said a short but meaningful sentence. "We'll figure it out ourselves." The way he said it made William realize that his reasonable request wasn't being seen as cooperation, but as a challenge. The atmosphere around them seemed to grow heavy, and in that brief moment, William clearly felt that this stop had taken a different turn. It's no longer a routine test, but is gradually turning into a confrontation where reason and procedure are pushed aside by assumptions and inflated egos. The officer standing by the driver's door took a half-step back, as if making a decision in his head. Then his voice suddenly hardened, sharper than before. "All right," he said, slowly but with clear authority. "Now get out of the car." Slowly. No unnecessary movements. William didn't react immediately. He knew this was a crucial moment, where every word carried legal weight, and every movement could be interpreted dangerously. He looked straight ahead, then very slowly turned his head to face the officer. "Before I comply with that request," he said, his voice even and firm as if speaking in court, "I need to know the legal basis for your request to get out of the car. I am in uniform and have already introduced myself." That statement did not ease the tension. On the contrary, it seemed to touch upon something very sensitive. The officer clenched his jaw, his eyes darkening. "Get out of the car. Right now," he repeated, this time without concealing his irritation. William understood that continuing the argument at this moment would only escalate things faster. He decided to comply, but in the most cautious way possible. "I'll open the door and get out," he said loudly enough for the camera to record. "I'll do it slowly. I'm not resisting." The car door opened. William stepped onto the pavement, each movement calculated. The afternoon sun shone directly on his uniform, making the gold badge and name tag on his chest gleam clearly. In that brief moment, anyone observing could see there was no ambiguity about who he was. But as soon as William straightened up, the officer strode quickly behind him, closing the distance aggressively. "Hands behind your back," he shouted. "Put your hands behind your back immediately." William stood still. He didn't turn, didn't react instinctively, only spoke in a calm but firm voice. "For what reason?" he asked. "What crime am I suspected of that you're handcuffing me?" The question was perfectly legal, but it received no answer. Instead, the officer grabbed William's wrist with force and suddenness, twisting his arm behind his back in a rough motion. The pain was immediate, not from William resisting, but from the unnecessary grip. "I'm not resisting," William said loudly, each word clear enough for all recording equipment to pick up. "I'm cooperating." Even so, the grip didn't lessen. The second officer moved closer, his eyes darting around as if waiting for something to happen. And then, instead of checking papers or calling the dispatcher, he turned and strode quickly toward the back of the SUV. In an instant, the tailgate swung open with a dry click. William turned his head just enough to see the action. "I don't consent to this search," he said, his voice remarkably controlled. "I don't authorize it. You have no warrant, and I gave no consent." Those words didn't stop the officer. He began rummaging inside, pulling out each bag, unlocking them, peering inside as if trying to find something that could justify what they were doing. Each item taken out only confirmed what William had said from the beginning. Sheriff's equipment, county property labels, clear serial numbers. But instead of stopping, the officer continued, as if the truth was less important than proving their initial decision was correct. The officer behind William pulled his arm up slightly, a gesture more punitive, then controlling, causing pain to spread down his arm and shoulder. "Do you think you know the law?" He whispered in William's ear, his voice low and cold. "We know what we're doing." Meanwhile, civilian cars began to slow down as they passed. Several pulled over to the side of the road. William heard car doors close, footsteps, and whispers. He knew that, at this moment, it wasn't just the police cameras recording everything. People's phones were pointed at them. And William understood perfectly well. From this moment on, the story was no longer solely in the hands of the two officers. Standing behind him, William kept his body as still as possible, even though his wrists were twisted behind his back in a completely unnecessary position. A dull ache spread from his wrists up his arms and shoulders, but he didn't show any reaction that could be misinterpreted. He knew that in moments like this, panic was contagious, and calmness was the only thing that could maintain control. He spoke slowly, clearly, each word carefully measured so that all recording devices could pick it up. "I repeat for the recording. I am not resisting. I do not consent to this search. You have no consent, no search warrant, and no legal basis whatsoever." The officer searching the back of the car didn't reply. He pulled a large tactical bag from the trunk, placed it on the pavement, and unlocked it, his eyes fixed as if waiting for that "I know" moment. But inside the bag were only familiar items: medical supplies, harnesses, gloves, standard equipment for a deputy on duty. Each item bore the county's property label, serial number, and clear markings. He continued searching, opening another box, then another. The result was the same. Nothing but the things already explained. William turned his head slowly, just enough for his voice to be clearer. "All you see here is Montgomery County Sheriff's Department equipment," he said. "You can verify this at any time via the switchboard." The words weren't provocative, but they seemed to irritate the officer behind him. The grip on his wrist tightened slightly, a reminder that the other man was still trying to assert control. "Silence," the officer growled. "We're working." William didn't argue. He just took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. He heard the traffic slow down, the soft screech of tires as several civilian cars slowed to observe. One car stopped abruptly at the side of the road, not far away. Then another. William sensed the presence of other eyes. People not in uniform, not carrying guns, but witnessing what was happening before them. He knew that, for many of them, the sight of a black man in sheriff's uniform being handcuffed and having his car searched in the middle of the highway was both incomprehensible and terrifying. A voice from afar rang out, not loud but clear enough. "He's in uniform, isn't he?" The officer conducting the search briefly looked up, then lowered his head again, pretending not to hear. The officer holding William's arm turned his head and shouted in that direction. "This is official business. Get out of the way." His voice was harsh and sharp, as if to drown out not only the voices of the civilians, but also the reality of the situation. William clearly sensed that things had gone beyond the limits of a wrongful stop. This was no longer a mistake that could be corrected with a few radio calls. This was a series of consecutive decisions, each pushing the situation further away from the legal path. He thought of the de-escalation training sessions he himself had taught, of the emphasis he always placed on his students. That power lies not in tightening the noose, but in the ability to stop at the right time. And ironically, he was now standing on the other side of that lesson. The other officer pulled out another bag and placed it on the road. Several items were temporarily set aside, creating a messy scene behind the SUV. Anyone looking could clearly see that it was law enforcement equipment, not the belongings of an imposter or a criminal. But it seemed that the clearer it was, the harder it was for them to accept that they had been wrong from the start. William realized something terrifying. When ego is pushed too high, truth is no longer something to seek, but something to deny. He was silent for a few seconds, then continued, his voice still even but carrying the weight of experience. "You are violating my rights," he said, "and you are doing it in front of witnesses." He didn't need to point to the phones held up in the distance. He knew they saw it too. The air around them seemed to tense, like a taut string. And somewhere in the distance, William heard the engine of another car slowing down, a short horn blast like a signal. He didn't know it at the time, but in that very moment, the wheels of final intervention began to roll toward them. The sound of the car slowing down in the distance grew louder, a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the passing civilian vehicles. William couldn't turn his head completely, but out of the corner of his eye and through his professional reflexes, he recognized it wasn't an ordinary vehicle. A low, steady engine roared. Then a flash of blue emergency lights appeared on the opposite side of the highway. The car pulled over to the other side, its lights flashing continuously, like an exclamation point in the already tense and suffocating scene. The car door opened. A man stepped out, his gait quick, decisive, and unwavering. Just by watching him cross the median, William knew this was someone accustomed to making decisions and taking responsibility for them. As the man drew closer, the afternoon sun illuminated the name tag on his chest, and William's heart sank slightly with a very different feeling. Not fear, but confirmation that what he had hoped for had finally arrived. Chief Deputy Robert Keller, the deputy commander of the entire Montgomery County Sheriff's Department. The man who had shaken William's hand at his promotion ceremony a few years ago. Keller paused, taking only a few seconds to scan the scene. William's hands were clasped behind his back. The SUV's tailgate was wide open. Equipment was scattered haphazardly on the pavement. Two city officers stood in positions that indicated they were in control, not inspecting. In that brief moment, Keller's expression changed dramatically, from surprise to bewilderment, then froze in a terrifyingly suppressed rage. "What the hell is going on here?" Keller said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and firm, enough to cut through all other sounds. "Who are you two? And why is one of my deputy officers handcuffed on the side of the road?" Both Riverside City officers turned their heads simultaneously. William felt the grip on his wrist falter for a split second, as if the person behind him had also noticed something had changed. The officer standing by the driver's door cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Sir, I am Officer Whitford, Riverside City Police. We stopped a suspicious vehicle as part of a routine investigation." Keller raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "A routine investigation," he repeated slowly. "By handcuffing someone in sheriff's uniform, driving a county car, with such obvious insignia?" He took another step forward, close enough that no one could feign avoidance. Keller turned to William. "Deputy Carter," he said, his voice low, carrying clear concern. "Are you injured?" William replied, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the slight loosening of his grip. "No, sir. But I've repeatedly introduced myself, requested verification via the switchboard, and refused a search. Even so, I'm being detained, and my car has been searched without justification." Every word William spoke was like a sentence read from an official report, neither adding nor subtracting, but enough to paint the whole picture. Keller snapped to the two Riverside officers, his gaze turning icy. "Release him. Now." The order left no room for delay or argument. Whitford released William almost instantly, as if he'd just touched something burning hot. William reached out, slowly rotating his wrist, clearly feeling the lingering pain. Keller stepped between him and the two officers, a position befitting someone who not only held rank, but also had the responsibility to protect his subordinate. "Now," Keller said, his voice low and clear, "I want to hear the legal reason for this stop. What violation are you basing this on? Where is the reasonable suspicion?" Silence fell. Whitford opened his mouth, then hesitated. Brennan stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the road. Keller continued, giving them no time to evade. "Did you roll your license plates before turning on your lights?" The silence stretched on, like an unspoken confession. Keller took a short breath, then spoke louder, loud enough for the onlookers filming from a distance to hear. "You stopped a Montgomery County Sheriff's Department vehicle. You detained a deputy in uniform. You conducted a search without consent, without a warrant, and without legal basis. And all of this is being recorded." He raised his hand to the radio, his voice firm. "Dispatch, this is Chief Keller. I need internal affairs to come to my location immediately. Also, call the Riverside City Watch commander. We're dealing with a serious case of misconduct. William stood there, taking a deep breath, feeling for the first time since the traffic lights came on that the ground beneath his feet had become firmer. He knew, from this moment on, the story was no longer controlled by those two officers. Procedure, law, and truth, things they had tried to ignore, were returning to power. The atmosphere on the highway shoulder changed dramatically after Chief Keller's final words. The earlier threatening tension had transformed into a heavy, awkward silence, as if the entire scene had been turned upside down. Whitford and Brennan stood a few paces from William, no longer pressing close, no longer giving orders, but also unsure of what to do next. Their movements slowed, becoming disjointed, and for the first time since stopping the car, they both looked like people who had just realized they had gone too far. William rubbed his wrist. The dull ache was still there, but he didn't let it show on his face. He straightened, adjusting his posture, his uniform now fully visible to everyone. Chief Keller, the civilians filming, and the two officers who had tried to deny it for the past half hour. Keller remained in front of him, a position that needed no explanation. That's how a commander says, from now on, he's not alone. Radio signals blared from multiple directions. First, a response from the county switchboard, confirming internal affairs was en route. Just seconds later, another signal cut in, this time from the Riverside City Police. Keller glanced toward the source of the sound, then turned to the two officers before him. Your watch commander is on his way, he said, his voice even but cold. I advise you to think carefully about every word you're about to say. Brennan swallowed hard, his gaze shifting between Keller and Whitford. Whitford stood rigid, his jaw clenched, but his initial confidence had vanished completely. William recognized that all too familiar sign. The moment a person understands, all justifications have run out. All that remains is the consequence. Less than a few minutes later, a car bearing the Riverside City Police insignia pulled over to the side of the road nearby. A commanding officer stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, and stern-faced. That was Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, watch commander of Riverside City. He paused briefly to observe the scene, just as Keller had done earlier. The trunk lid was open. Equipment was laid out on the pavement. A deputy sheriff stood beside his commander. His two officers stood silently, no longer in a commanding posture. Hayes stepped forward, his eyes meeting Keller's first. Chief Keller, he said, nodding briefly. I am Marcus Hayes. I have been notified of a serious incident involving my officer. Keller didn't beat around the bush. He pointed to William, then to the two Riverside officers. Your officer stopped one of my deputy officers without justification, detained him, and conducted a search of the vehicle without authorization or warrant. All of this is on camera. Hayes turned to Whitford and Brennan, his voice lowering. You too? He asked directly, without beating around the bush. Did you scan the license plates before stopping? Both remained silent. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to answer. Hayes frowned. Was there any identity verification when he introduced himself as deputy sheriff? Brennan shook his head very slightly, as if hoping the small movement would go unnoticed. Hayes exhaled slowly, his eyes darkening. Was there consent to opening the trunk and searching it? This time, Whitford answered, his voice hoarse and low. No, sir. Hayes turned to look at Keller. In that brief moment, William could clearly see the mixture of anger and frustration on the watch commander's face. I apologize, Hayes said, not as a formality, but as a heavy admission. Then he turned to his two officers, his voice firm, without a hint of hesitation. Officer Whitford, Officer Brennan, you are temporarily suspended from duty immediately. Hand over your weapons, insignia, and belts. Now, the words struck the scene like a hammer blow. Whitford stood still for a few seconds, then slowly unbuckled his belt, his hands visibly trembling. Brennan followed suit, his face pale. The sound of metal clashing as they placed the weapons and badges into Hayes's hands was dry and unsettling. Bystanders murmured softly. A few phones zoomed in. William stood there, silent. He felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, just a familiar, somber feeling. The feeling when a mistake can no longer be concealed, and the truth finally forces everyone to confront it. He looked down at the equipment scattered haphazardly on the pavement, then back at his SUV, its tailgate still open. Part of him felt weary. Another part understood. This wasn't the end. This was just the point where the wheels of responsibility truly began to turn. Following Lieutenant Hayes's immediate suspension, the scene fell into an eerie silence. No more shouting. No more harsh orders. Only the sound of the wind on the highway and the slow-moving engines of passing vehicles as onlookers watched from a distance. Whitford and Brennan stood to one side, no longer appearing as enforcers of authority, but rather as two individuals who had just been stripped of something that had once given them absolute security. Their badges and guns were gone. That alone was enough to completely shift the balance of the story. Captain Jennifer Morrison from Montgomery County's Internal Affairs Department arrived shortly afterward. She stepped out of her car with a notebook, a small camera, and the demeanor of someone accustomed to handling situations no one wants to face. Morrison said little. She walked around the scene, photographing William's SUV, its trunk open, its equipment scattered haphazardly on the pavement. She carefully noted the location of each item, then approached William. "Deputy Carter," she said, her voice calm and professional, "I need you to provide an initial summary of what happened. Just the main points. We'll have a formal meeting in 24 hours. William nodded. He stood straight, his hands relaxed in front of him, his voice returning to the familiar rhythm of someone reporting an incident. He began with the Crown Victoria tailgating, with the absence of any traffic violations, with his repeated self-introduction and requests for verification via the switchboard. He spoke of being asked to get out of the car, of having his hands held behind his back, of clearly refusing a search but the trunk being opened. There was no superfluous emotion in his account, only sequence, detail, and precision. Morrison listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally taking quick notes. When William mentioned his repeated refusal to cooperate with the search, she paused for a second, looked up at him, and continued writing. She turned to Hayes. "These two officers' body cams will be sealed as evidence," she said. "The deputy's dash cam will too." Hayes nodded immediately. "Absolutely," he replied. "I'll make sure no one interferes." Meanwhile, several civilians began to approach, keeping their distance but clearly wanting to say something. A middle-aged man held up his phone, still recording. "I've recorded almost everything," he told Morrison. "If needed, I'm willing to provide the video." Morrison thanked him and asked another deputy to record the witness's contact information. William watched the scene with a strange mix of emotions. He had said from the beginning that everything was being recorded, but only by witnessing the willingness of these civilians firsthand did he truly understand the weight of independent evidence. Lieutenant Hayes pulled Whitford and Brennan aside, whispering something William couldn't quite hear. But he could guess the content, the next steps, their rights and obligations, and what they were about to face. Both looked like shadows of themselves. No more rebuttals, no more defiant glances. Only the silence of those who had just realized that not everything could be resolved with an internal report or a few lines of explanation. Chief Keller turned to William, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder, a brief but meaningful gesture. "You handled it right," Keller said softly. "Stay calm. Take note. That protected you." William nodded. "I just did what we've always taught," he replied. "Let process and facts speak for themselves." Keller looked at him for a moment, then turned back to the scene, where the pieces of the story were being gathered, sealed, and put back in order. As the final pieces of equipment were placed back in the trunk and the rear door of the SUV closed, William realized the slight tremor in his chest had finally subsided. But he also knew that what had just happened on the highway shoulder wouldn't end when everyone got into their cars and drove away. The video recordings, the testimonies, and the unanswered questions would continue to haunt all involved for days, weeks, even years to come. And somewhere beyond him, this story was about to become a much larger test for the system they all served. As the scene gradually came under control and vehicles began to leave in waves, William Carter remained in his SUV for a few more minutes before starting the engine. Not because he wasn't ready to leave, but because his body and mind needed a brief moment of quiet to process what had just happened. His hands on the steering wheel still felt slightly tense, a lingering effect of having to remain calm for so long. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Whitford and Brennan being escorted back to the command vehicle by Lieutenant Hayes, without their badges, without their guns, and without the air of those who believed themselves untouchable. William drove off the curb, rejoining the traffic, but the road back to the administration building suddenly seemed longer than usual. His mind began to piece together every detail, every word, every gesture. It was a professional habit, not to fuel anger, but to ensure that when the time came, he could recount everything accurately and without distortion. He knew that from this point on, the story had entered a different phase. It was no longer a direct confrontation on the roadside. This was when the files, the video, and the formal procedures began to take effect. Less than 2 days later, both departments, Montgomery County Sheriff's Department and Riverside City Police, launched internal investigations with unprecedented speed. The reason was clear. Williams' dashcam video showed the entire sequence of events, from the Crown Victoria appearing behind them, to every command, every time he introduced himself, every time he clearly stated he did not consent to a search. Everything unfolded exactly as he had described. But what truly silenced many was Whitford and Brennan's bodycam footage. In the footage before they stopped, 2 voices could be heard in the Crown Victoria's cabin. "A guy like that, driving that kind of car around here," Whitford said. "Not good," Brennan replied, half jokingly, half seriously. "It might be a stolen car. Let's stop and check it to be sure." There was no mention of a traffic violation, no intelligence information, no specific description of the suspect. Just a stark assumption, stated so naturally, as if it were the obvious thing to do, requiring no further thought. When that recording was played in the Internal Affairs briefing room, no one spoke for the first few seconds. That silence weighed more heavily than any criticism. It not only revealed a flawed decision, but also exposed the thinking that led to it. For the investigators, this was the moment the matter transcended procedural error and entered the realm of something far more serious: motive. News spread quickly, first within the department, then to the wider community. The Riverside City Police Department was forced to issue a statement confirming it was investigating the 2 officers for serious misconduct. William was invited for a formal interview with Internal Affairs, this time a lengthy one. He answered each question one by one, without embellishment or speculation, sticking to what had happened and what the camera had recorded. For him, this wasn't the time to argue or prove himself. This was the time for the truth to stand on its own. Meanwhile, in Riverside City, Lieutenant Hayes submitted his preliminary report to his superiors. The report was straightforward. It clearly listed every procedural step that had been skipped, every wrong decision made, and especially emphasized the failure to run license plates, the failure to verify identity when requested, and the search conducted without consent. Those dry words, when placed alongside the video footage, became as sharp as a knife. There was no way to soften the explanation or interpret it in context. Just a week later, the official decision was made. Whitford and Brennan were suspended without pay pending investigation. But even before the final results were announced, many in the industry understood that their path back was virtually non-existent. When the initial motives are so clearly documented, any argument about good faith becomes meaningless. William watched the events unfold with a feeling of both distance and closeness. He felt neither joy nor complete relief. Instead, a recurring thought ran through his mind. If there were no cameras, if there were no witnesses, if he had reacted even slightly differently that day, how would this story be told? That question wasn't directed solely at him, but at the entire system. And he knew this wouldn't end with disciplining 2 officers. It was opening a chain of far larger consequences that would force many to reconsider how they wielded power when no one thought they were being watched. The consequences William had foreseen began to become apparent just weeks later. Before the internal investigation was even closed, the case was transferred to the district attorney's office for criminal review. That decision alone spoke volumes about the seriousness of what happened on the highway that day. This was no longer a matter of internal disciplinary action or learning a lesson. When a traffic stop is determined to have violated civil rights, especially under the guise of law enforcement, it crosses a completely different line. William received a call from a civil rights lawyer just days after the news began to spread. He said bluntly, Without embellishment, you have a very strong case. Not just for you, but for many others. William didn't reply immediately. He wasn't in a hurry. Throughout his career, he had always believed that the law shouldn't be used as a tool for retaliation, but to correct what had gone wrong. But the more he reviewed the footage and read the reports, the more he understood that if the incident only resulted in firings or suspensions, the message would be, things only go wrong when caught. 3 weeks after the car stop, William Carter formally filed a civil rights lawsuit in federal court. The lawsuit targeted Whitford and Brennan individually, but also listed the Riverside City Police Department and the city of Riverside itself as defendants. The content was clear: violations of the Fourth Amendment regarding unlawful detention and search, violations of the 14th Amendment through racial discrimination, along with allegations of assault and mental harm. It wasn't an emotional indictment. It was a rigorous legal document, every line backed by video, testimony, and training records. The city of Riverside reacted almost immediately. Their legal counsel requested to see the entire video, uncut and unedited. And when the bodycam footage from before the car stopped was played in that closed-door meeting room, the atmosphere became so heavy it was suffocating. No one needed to explain anything further. The recorded statements were too clear, too natural, and too damaging. Any defensive strategies based on situational assessment or safety concerns collapsed on the spot. Alongside the civil lawsuit, the district attorney announced it was considering criminal prosecution against the 2 former officers for deprivation of civil rights in the name of official authority. This news spread like a small shockwave through regional law enforcement circles. Such prosecutions are rare, and when they do occur, they send a very clear message. There are lines that, if crossed, will no longer be a shield. Riverside City faced a difficult choice. Going to court meant exposing the whole issue to the jury and the public, risking not only losing the case, but also receiving a symbolic sentence. Negotiation, on the other hand, meant admitting systemic wrongdoing. After weeks of closed-door meetings, they chose the second option. Not because they wanted to, but because the evidence left them with no other choice. The negotiations were tense. William's side demanded not only financial compensation for what he had endured, but also binding changes. He made it clear to his lawyer, if it all ends with just a number, it won't change anything. And that's what made this case different. It was no longer about who was right or wrong, but about what the system would learn from a mistake that had been so blatantly exposed on camera. When the final agreement was put on the table, it was more than just a large sum of money. It was a long list of things Riverside City had to do: mandatory training in bias detection, stricter monitoring of vehicle stops, collection and analysis of racial data, and the establishment of an independent, truly authoritative monitoring mechanism. William read each line slowly, then signed, not with a sense of victory, but with the cautious hope that at least this incident would bring about some change. And while public opinion focused on the numbers in the agreement, William thought of something else. He thought of the moment on the sidewalk when he stood still, his hands clasped behind his back, and wondered how many others had stood in that spot without cameras, without a passing supervisor, without anyone with enough authority to say stop. That very thought made him realize that this story wasn't over yet. It was just moving to the next chapter, where the consequences were no longer personal, but were beginning to affect the entire system. The criminal trial took place nearly 8 months after that car stop, in a courtroom packed more than anyone had anticipated. Not only were there journalists and members of the public interested, but also numerous officers from various units quietly seated in the back rows. They were not there to cheer or protest, but to witness firsthand a crucial boundary: the boundary between granted power and abused power. Whitford and Brennan sat at the defendant's table, no longer in uniform, no longer in badges, only dark suits that couldn't conceal the tension etched on their faces. The prosecutor didn't begin with flowery words. She switched on the large screen in the courtroom and simply said, "Let's see what really happened." Video from William Carter's dashcam played, capturing the entire car stop from the very first second. Then came Whitford and Brennan's bodycam footage, uncut and unedited. The courtroom fell silent as the pre-lighting audio recording was played. These short, seemingly harmless statements, when placed in this context, carry undeniable weight. There was no traffic violation, no description of the suspect, only an assumption based on appearance and skin color. The defense attorneys tried to twist the narrative. They spoke of the pressures of the job, of split-second decisions, of the constant safety concerns faced by police officers on the streets. But each argument was thwarted by the images and sounds from the camera. When William Carter was called to testify, he didn't tell his story emotionally. He told it chronologically, by time, by precisely recorded words. He reiterated how he had identified himself, requested verification, refused a search, and remained calm throughout. That composure, even in the courtroom, remained unchanged. The law enforcement procedure expert called upon by the prosecution then made a statement that caused many in the courtroom to nod slightly. "There is no curriculum," he said, "that allows an officer to bypass clear verification of information on a hunch. And there are no exceptions to unprovoked searches." That statement was a bold line, a clear separation between human error and systemic violation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the entire courtroom rose. The moment the judge read the verdict, Whitford closed his eyes. Brennan stared down at the table. "Guilty," the judge read clearly, word for word, all the main charges. There was no uproar, no explosive reaction, only a heavy silence. For everyone understood the significance of this verdict went far beyond the two men standing before the dock. The sentence was pronounced several weeks later. Imprisonment, probation, and a permanent ban from law enforcement. Those dry words closed the career paths of two men who had once believed their badges would protect them from all consequences. They left the courtroom in silence. No public apology, no explicit admission. Only averted glances and heavy footsteps. William sat for a while longer after the trial ended. He watched the room gradually empty, reflecting on the long road that had led him here. From an unwarranted stop on the highway shoulder to the sentences handed down under the courtroom lights. He felt neither satisfied nor completely relieved. What he felt most acutely was a new responsibility placed upon him. The responsibility to ensure that what happened would not be forgotten as an isolated incident, but remembered as a costly lesson about what happens when prejudice takes over the law. In the months following the trial, William Carter's life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, but it was no longer the same. He returned to Montgomery County Sheriff's Department to the quiet respect of his colleagues. There were no applause, no public cheers, just nods, understanding glances, and a clear sense that everyone knew how he had stood firm during the hardest times. 6 months later, William was promoted, not as a reward for the incident, but because his track record had always been excellent. This time, he was assigned to the training department. There, William began doing what he considered most important. He didn't tell his story for dramatic effect. He used it as a life lesson. During training sessions, he would play videos, uncut and uncensored, and let the trainees watch and listen to them. Then he would ask them a simple question. Where did the first mistake happen? Not during the handcuffing. It wasn't about opening the trunk. It was the moment they saw a person and let prejudice dictate the process. William emphasized that an officer's true power lay not in their gun or badge, but in their ability to stop, check, and ask themselves, "Am I sure?" In Riverside City, the changes began to show impact. Data on vehicle stops was collected and made public. Periodically, officers with worrying behavioral patterns were placed under early supervision. The Civilian Oversight Board accepted previously ignored complaints. Not everything was perfect, but the numbers began to shift in a positive direction, and more importantly, no one could say, "This never happened." William was also invited to speak at community forums and professional conferences. Each time, he made one thing clear. The problem isn't a few bad people. The problem is a system that allows mistakes to be repeated without being exposed. He spoke of cameras not as tools of punishment, but as tools of protection for both sides, citizens and officers, as long as people were willing to respect what they recorded. Years later, the Montgomery County Highway side incident was still recounted in classrooms and curricula. It became a prime example of what happens when assumptions replace facts, and what can happen when evidence forces people to face the consequences. Whitford and Brennan faded from the news, but the legacy of the decision they made that day did not. It lives on in policy changes, in difficult dialogues, and in instances where an officer decides to run a license plate before turning on their lights. And William Carter, now with a higher rank and a larger role, is often asked if he regrets pursuing the case to the end. He always answers the same way: no, because if I had remained silent, the message would have been that silence is acceptable. He understood he was lucky. There were cameras, witnesses, and a commander who appeared at the right moment. And that understanding only strengthened his resolve to ensure justice doesn't depend on luck. This story isn't about saying the system is completely fixed. It simply demonstrates a simple but crucial point. When the truth is recorded, when people are calm enough not to self-destruct, and when there is a will to hold accountable, then change is possible. The traffic lights on that highway didn't just stop one car. They stopped a chain of behaviors, exposed a problem, and opened another path, a path where the law leads, not prejudice. And if this story leaves you with a thought, it's this: no one is above the law, no one should be judged before being verified, and in a world full of cameras and evidence, the wisest choice is always the right choice from the start.